Hey everybody, so today we are talking about amphibians. So amphibians are described as cold-blooded vertebrates that have 4 distinct legs and live at least part of their lives in an aquatic environment. This is a huge thing with amphibians. We're going to get to the 4 legs part in a second, but the aquatic environment is very characteristic. They do not have to be fully aquatic, although some are, but they have to spend at least one part of their life in the water. So we started with fish, which were fully aquatic. Now we're looking at something that was partially aquatic, and then we'll move into things that were fully terrestrial. So the term amphibian comes from the Latin for double life. And this, again, alludes to this concept of spending at least part of the life in the water and another part on land. Amphibians are metamorphic animals, meaning they go through multiple different life stages, and each stage has very characteristic features. The larval stage is typically always in the water. So anything that has 4 well-formed limbs, typically 2 forelimbs and 2 hind limbs, are called tetrapods. And tetrapod animals are believed to be more evolutionarily advanced than things like invertebrates or fish. So what then is the evolutionary link between fish and our first tetrapods, which are amphibians? And we're not quite sure what the missing link, quote unquote, there is, but we do believe that it most likely was something called the tiktaalik. And if you look at the diagram that I've provided for you, tiktaalik is located right there in the center upper middle. So tiktaalik was definitely a fish. It had all of the anatomy and qualifications of a fish, but it had a couple of evolutionary adaptations that are very odd and out of place for a traditional fish that lead us to believe that it may have been a common ancestor of the amphibians. So some people call tiktaalik the fishapod, and the reason for it is, while I said it's very clearly a fish, it has some tetrapod features. And I want you to take a look at the image of tiktaalik fossil that I have there for you. So this is our first tiktaalik fossil. It was found in the Canadian Arctic in 2004, and carbon dating has placed it at 375 million years old, which is impressive. But I want you to focus in on the head shape. What does it look like to you? And hopefully you're thinking alligator or crocodile, because it has a very characteristic head shape of the type of organism that typically would lift its head up out of the water. That flattened head shape is found in a lot of aquatic animals that regularly lift their heads up. And that I'm talking about that like sloped, elongated face. Something else about tiktaalik that maybe gives us some evidence that it could be a common ancestor of the amphibians is in the pectoral fins. So the pectoral fins are the equivalent of a forelimb in fish. And tiktaalik had very elongated, muscular pectoral fins. And it is believed that it's very likely that tiktaalik used these fins to place on the muddy riverbed to lift itself up out of the water and lift its head up out of the water. And while that doesn't mean that tiktaalik had the ability to walk or crawl along the ocean floor, it does beg the question, would this perhaps lead itself over time to an animal that could live on land or walk out of the water as needed? So there are 3 orders of amphibians. The first is class Gymnophiona, class Caudata, and class Anura. While those words probably don't mean anything to you now, you are familiar with the organisms that live in those classes. So class Gymnophiona, that might be the one that you are the least familiar with. Those are the caecilians. Caudata would be your salamanders and your newts, and your anurans are your frogs and your toads. So these are caecilians. And if you're anything like me, this is the one that I was the least familiar with. So your caecilians come from the Latin term for blind or naked snake. And if you're looking at the picture like I am, it's pretty clear why you would call it a naked snake, because it does look very worm or snake-like. It has a long, limbless, segmented body, but it is an amphibian. If you look at the close-up of the caecilian face, you can see those creepy little beady eyes that are essentially blind. So they're actually covered over with a thin, distinct layer of skin, which makes the caecilian pretty much blind, with the exception of its ability to maybe differentiate a little bit about light intensity. And the reason why this doesn't really matter for the caecilian is it is a soil burrower. It lives in the ground and it eats things like small invertebrates and worms. And you would think, well, maybe they're really rare because I've never seen one in the wild. And the answer to that is it's really not. They're actually found on all continents with the exception of Australia and Antarctica. They are very widespread. They just happen to be fairly reclusive and they live in the ground. So something big about order Gymnophiona is that they are the only amphibians who have live birth. So that doesn't mean that they're not metamorphic. They are, but the metamorphosis actually happens inside the mother. So they reproduce sexually, they have internal fertilization, those eggs develop internally, and the metamorphosis actually happens inside the mother, and the larval caecilians feed on the oviduct of their mother by scraping their tiny little creepy teeth against the inside of their moms. And then when they are born, they emerge as tiny little adults. So these are our caudata, the salamanders and newts. And real quick, difference between salamanders and newts. All newts are salamanders, but not all salamanders are newts. And the big difference has to do with the smoothness of the skin and its need for water to some extent. So caudata is Latin for tail bearer because all salamanders have tails. And actually their tails make up about half of their overall body length, which is very characteristic for them. They do look slightly more like lizards, but they are much more closely related to things like frogs than they would be to a reptile. They have very characteristic short, fat bodies in comparison to their long tails, and they prefer very temperate, moist environments. You can find some in the tropics, but 90% of them actually live in the northern hemisphere. They don't like temperature change that is very drastic, so you will find them in more temperate regions. Here's another example of a member of order Caudata. So some salamanders are 100% aquatic, but all salamanders have to breed in the water at the very least. So most larval or juvenile stages will develop in the water, and then most adults typically live on land. So this picture here is of an axolotl. So axolotls spend their entire lives in the water. So they can be fully aquatic, but most are terrestrial, at least for some stage of their life, typically the adult stage. So 90% of salamanders practice internal fertilization without copulation. So what that means is they do not actually have sex. There is no intercourse. So what happens is the males produce something called a spermatophore, which is a protein capsule full of sperm. And they will deposit that in the soil. And as the females crawl over the soil, they will pick up that spermatophore with their abdomens, and it will go into a pouch called the spermatheca. And when the female is ready for reproduction, that sperm will pass from the spermatheca to the cloacal region, the cloaca being the singular hole where everything leaves the body. And egg meets sperm, fertilization happens, and the fertilized eggs get laid back in the soil again. So salamanders, their larval stages always have gills, and they are always aquatic. So again, this highlights this relationship between the amphibian and water. At least with salamanders, they're so incredibly dependent that they will not reproduce unless it happens in the water. After a given time period, you're going to have metamorphosis, and that metamorphosis happens into the adult form. So you have a couple of different choices if you're a salamander in terms of your metamorphosis. So a lot of them are called pedomorphic, which means they essentially have the ability to hold on to larval features even though they are internally adults. They are sexually mature and able to reproduce on their own. You can be an obligate pedomorphic, or you can be facultatively pedomorphic. Obligate, think obligation. They have to do it. So they really don't have a choice but to maintain these larval features, versus a facultative pedomorphic organism would be able to selectively choose, essentially, whether they want to leave the water and become terrestrial. Do they want to lose their gills? Do they want to lose their fins? Things like that. So if you look at these pictures, I've given you an example of both. So on the left-hand side, this is a mud puppy. Mud puppies are going to be in the water all the time. They are obligate paedomorphs. They do not have the ability to lose their gills. You can see it's like that burnt orange color up around the neck. And then you can see their tail has a very clear fin on it to aid in swimming. Then on your right-hand side, this is an ambystoma. The ambystomas have the ability to choose if they're going to live their lives in the water or if they want to then venture on to land as an adult, which makes them facultative. They can choose it. So look at picture A of your ambystoma for me, and you can see, again, up by the neck, you've got that very clear gill. You have the fin on the tail. And then if you look at picture B, same type of animal, except for now, if you focus in on the head region, it's changing very drastically. You've lost those gills. You've now developed a different physical marking and physical look to the animal itself. And then if you look at the tails, you can see where the tail is in the process of kind of cleaving off that fin in preparation for leaving the water. So then this brings us to our anurans, or our frogs. So anura is from the Latin term for without a tail, because adult anurans do not have tails, and that is very characteristic of your frogs and your toads. So there are over 4,000 species of frogs and toads. They are very, very diverse, but they all have a couple of things in common. One being they have webbed feet, which for the most part allows them to go into the water. We'll talk about toads a little later. They are very characteristically tailless as an adult, and they are found in so many different environments. Anurans actually experience the most drastic metamorphosis. So if you think of a tadpole, they look very, very intensely different from their adult form. So the larval form of an anuran is going to be very different in its appearance from the adult form of the anuran because of things like losing that tail. The tail exists as a larval stage. It does not exist in the adult. So here's your frogs and your toads, differences between them. So frogs tend to be more moist-skinned, very, very smooth, would likely be found in areas that are very wet and moist. So things like rivers and lakes and ponds, very close to those environments you would find your frogs. And they are from the family Ranidae. Your toads are going to be more dry and that warty, kind of bumpy appearance. False. You cannot get warts from frogs and toads. Okay, that is a lie that someone spun however many years ago, but don't believe it. Toads come from family Bufonidae, and they are more terrestrial, and you can find them in slightly drier climates. So again, my anurans reproduce sexually via external fertilization. So they rely on something called amplexus to help them with their fertilization. And amplexus is a very distinct body positioning. So the female is on the bottom, the male is positioned there on the top, and essentially it hooks the dorsal ends of the organism then together so they can make sure that egg and sperm contact each other upon egg laying. It can last anywhere from 1 to 24 hours. So amplexus can be a very short experience or a very long experience, but it is external fertilization. Okay. Also, frogs use something called vocalization or advertisement. So if you're sitting in bed at night and you listen and you can hear a frog outside croaking over and over and over again, that's advertisement. They're looking for a mate. Males tend to be the most aggressive and loud with their vocalizations, although females still have the ability to vocalize. Differences between males and females. Two big ones that I want to focus on, and then I'll mention a couple of others. But one is the size of the tympanum or the tympanic membrane. So if you're looking at that top left photo, you can see the small disc right above the smile line of the mouth. And then if you go over one more, you can see how it's so much bigger. So males have larger tympanums and tympanic membranes than females. They don't 100% know the reason for this, but they do think it has something to do with the vocalizations and being in need of hearing yourself making certain sounds so that you can attract a mate, and potentially that could be why male frogs would need such a large tympanic membrane. Also, body size. Females tend to be significantly larger than your male frogs. Something that I didn't put on this slide that's also a way you can look is it has to do with the I'm going to call it the hand of the frog, even though it's not. It's actually called the manus. But it's what the digits are attached to. So think the palm of your hand. It's that version in the frog. Males tend to have a larger manus. Reason for it being that it allows them to have more surface area to grasp onto the female during amplexus. So the skin of the amphibian is going to be really, really important. One, it's a protective barrier. It keeps them moist. It protects them from the outside world, and it's also antimicrobial. It fights the growth of microorganisms. So they're very, very resilient animals because of their skin. But something else really important about their skin is all amphibians are actually toxic. They all produce toxins from their skin, but the level of toxicity varies from species to species based on the type of toxin that they produce. So something like the poison dart frog is going to produce so much toxin that it could kill 10 adults just from barely contacting them. But a common toad, if you ate a toad, it would make you sick to your stomach, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. You'd be fine. And it has to do with the fact that they're producing different toxins, and those different toxins obviously have different levels of toxicity. The coloration of amphibian skin also plays a really huge role in evolutionary change and in their survival. There are a couple of different choices in terms of coloration, and not all amphibians show one, but most of them do in some way. So the cells of the amphibian are full of, or the skin of the amphibian, are full of cells called chromatophores. And these chromatophores are pigment producers, and they allow the amphibian to have a lot of different coloration patterns that can really lend themselves to survival. So one is called cryptic coloration, which is your camouflage. So if you look at your picture of the salamander in the far left-hand side, that's your cryptic coloration, the ability to blend in with one's environment. The second is aposematic coloration, which is warning coloration, and you can see that in the central picture. Warning coloration is advertisement that, hey, I am poisonous, stay away. Animals respond very well to this because they will learn that if something is brightly colored, it is not going to make a good meal. I should probably not try and attack or eat this animal. So then that leads into our third option for coloration, which is mimicry. Some animals will have evolved in a way to show warning coloration when they're not actually poisonous. They're not dangerous, but they have learned to look very similar to something that is, so that they can have protection. If you look at the picture of my two frogs there, one of them is an imitator frog, and we're going to talk about them in a few minutes. So basically, one animal that's not toxic and is perfectly fine as a meal for a predator will look as if it is toxic in order to survive. Another big example of that, while it's not an amphibian, would be your viceroy moth and your monarch butterfly. So the monarch feeds on milkweed, tastes like crap, things don't want to eat it. But then your viceroy, which is a perfectly good snack for a bird, has evolved to have this patterning on its body that looks very similar to the monarch, so that birds will steer clear of it, and it gives it a better survival chance. So here's your Batesian mimicry, which is what I was just referring to with the imitator frog in the last slide. So Batesian mimicry is this idea of a harmless species imitating a poisonous or harmful one. So if you look at your pictures, the imitator frog, and you can see that it's marked R imitator in both pictures, has a very similar physical marking and skin coloration to some of these very toxic frogs that live near them. And you can see that these are both imitator frogs, but based on the poisonous species that live in its area, they actually have very distinct appearances on different continents, which is pretty cool. So something I mentioned earlier is that all amphibians undergo metamorphosis, and this is a really huge concept for your amphibians. So all amphibians are dioecis, meaning they're either male or female. They have very clear genders, and they do have a metamorphic change in their lives. So typically there are 3 distinct life stages: egg, larva, and adult. So you lay the eggs then hatch into a larval form. That larval form will metamorphose into your adult over time. And for the most part, this is driven by hormone release and like an internal clock. But in some organisms and some species, it's very environmentally controlled. So if the environmental conditions are not ideal for metamorphosis, sometimes it won't happen. So the big differences between your larval forms and your adult forms: the presence of gills. So for most adult anurans, we'll take them for an example, when they're in the water, they actually respirate through their skin. But when they're on land, they would have lungs. In a larval form, the lungs aren't there and they breathe simply through gills. Also, the presence and type of tail. So I emphasize type of tail because in things like salamanders, the larval form would have a very fin-like tail versus a typical muscular tail in the adult. In anurans, presence of tail. Is there one versus is there not? Because adults don't have them. Also, the development of the reproductive organs. So that takes us back to our idea of the paedomorphosis, because the ones that are obligate paedomorphics, they would have reproductive organs that are functional but still have larval external features. So the development of those reproductive organs can tell you whether or not something has metamorphosed. And then changes in coloration, and you would have noticed that in the picture of our ambystoma, how we said the head patterning did change between the larval form and the adult form. Last thing we're going to talk about is parental care. Do amphibians take care of their babies? So it's not the norm. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. There are some forms of parental care practiced in amphibians, but for the most part, they practice something called egg attendance and larval abandonment. Parental care is really energy taxing. It requires a lot of resources and energy on the part of the parent, which if you are trying to survive on your own is often not feasible for the organism. So what they will do is they will attend to their eggs, meaning either the male or the female will stay close enough to the eggs to take care of them and see them hatch. When I say take care of them, they will clean out the dead eggs. So if there's one that is unfertilized or has started to mold or rot or has a parasite, they would remove those from the clutch so that they didn't potentially hurt the others. They'll also moisten their eggs if they're on land, and they'll aerate their eggs if they're laid in water. But once those eggs hatch, they abandon the larva. So that's why you don't typically see the mother frog hopping around the tadpoles. The tadpoles are just in the water. And then they will metamorphose and go about their business as adults. So they'll care for the eggs to some extent, but they do typically abandon their larvae. So lastly, I included this picture to show you a couple of other forms of parental care. But again, for the most part, this is egg attendance and larval abandonment. So you can see the different eggs being laid on these frogs, whether it's some of them are under the skin, on their backs. And then as they become larvae and hatch, that parent would then leave. And that brings us to the end of our little talk through. I know it was long. Thanks for hanging there with me. If you have questions, hit me up and let me know. Otherwise, have a good week, you guys.